the way that textbook explains this stuff right here, but let me try to make the best of it and you can take it for what it's worth. We have little areas, and we call them capillary beds. Now, one of the capillary beds that I've talked about here this morning is the capillary beds in your face, for example. And you can open up and allow lots of blood to flow out into those capillaries, or you can squeeze down the arterioles and not allow much blood to flow out into the skin. In order to be able to do that, you have to have thoroughfare channels that sort of allow the blood to bypass one area or another. And so that's basically what we're talking about here, is there are these thoroughfare channels that allow the blood to flow directly out of the arterioles, directly into the venules, and head back to the heart. They are controlled by smooth muscle in the walls of the arterioles. Remember, all of the control of all of the blood flow is controlled by smooth muscle in the walls of arterioles. So this is kind of a diagram that is a schematic way of showing this. Depending on, all of these are little capillaries that have little sphincters in them, you see here. And this is all schematic. So here's the blood coming into this particular area. And these little sphincters can either be open, like this one, allowing the blood to flow through, or they can be closed, like this one, and not allow any blood to flow through here. Now this is an example here of a thoroughfare channel, you could say. It goes right, if it's open, which it is in this case, pours through here. Doesn't really go out into the little tiny capillaries, just kind of flows right on through and hits back up into the venules. This is another one called an AV anastomosis, which is a direct connection between an artery over here and a vein over there. Once again, these are sort of thoroughfare channels that will allow blood to bypass the capillary bed. And what that means is that you've got some blood that's flowing back to your heart that's more oxygenated than otherwise. The blood that's coming out of these capillaries has probably had all of its hemoglobin stripped of its oxygen. It's down to, 40% O2 saturation for the hemoglobin saturation. Obviously these guys right here, this blood coming back here through maybe passing at 85, 87%, which is what it left the heart with. And so it's sort of wasted blood flow in a way, because it's taken the oxygen right back to the heart where it came from. This is a microscope picture trying to illustrate what they just did in that diagram. Once again, arterioles allow blood to flow through. Some of them can be squeezed down and shut off. Some of them aren't. I'm not sure how helpful that picture really is. The thing that controls all these things are these little capillary sphincters. We have sphincters all through our bodies. These are little things that squeeze things and close things off. These little sphincters can open and close and either allow capillary blood to flow into a region or to not flow into a region. And I'll just leave it at that. You're not going to see this on a microscope picture. Let's talk about veins for a little bit now. Now we've been talking about arteries carrying blood out. We talked about capillaries for a bit, talked about the blood as it goes through the tissues and how some of it bypasses and goes through the thoroughfare vessels. But now let's talk about it going back to the heart. And veins are pretty boring, to be honest with you. They are very thin-walled. They're much larger in diameter than the arteries. They always return blood to the heart because that's the definition of a vein, remember. The walls of veins are very thin, especially in comparison to the wall of an artery. And they always have a much lower blood pressure. We're going to talk about the blood pressure in the vessels as we go through the system here in a minute. The veins have a hard time, because they are so low pressure, they have a hard time pumping the blood all the way back up to the heart. Now think about it. If you're a 6-foot guy like me and you've got blood in your feet down here, and that blood has to work its way all the way up to the heart, that's a pretty tall column of blood. And if it was just a pure tube, the blood down here at the bottom would be under pretty high pressure. And so what our body has come up with is these venous valves like this. We have probably between our foot and our groin, we probably have 5 sets of these things. And they're really tiny, as you see here. We see them in surgery once in a blue moon, but believe me, they are about the thickness of toilet paper, if that thick. They are incredibly fine, and that's because the pressure in here is very fine. So the whole deal is the blood can flow up, and then it can't flow back. It can flow up and can't flow back. And then it works its way, it only has a column that's this tall here, which is what, 5 inches maybe, and then it works its way through this next valve, and then it can't flow back. Now, remember, we don't have a pump or anything down here, but we sort of do. And the pump that we have in our legs is called the muscle pump, because the veins run right up through the middle of our muscles. And every time we take a step or walk or contract our leg muscles, we squeeze the muscles, which squeezes the veins. This whole thing gets squeezed, and you see it illustrated right here. That pushes the blood upstream, and it pumps it through. It pushes it up through this next valve. Then the valve closes, and blood works its way on up towards the heart. So this is really a description of what's called the muscle pump. This becomes very important in medicine. Occasional patients will develop what's called phlebitis, and phlebitis is an inflammation of the inside of the blood vessels. Now, phlebitis doesn't hurt the veins too much in general, but a little bit of swelling in these valves and a little bit of scarring in those valves just ruins them. It ruins them so they don't meet anymore. So now the blood can flow up and the blood can flow back, and the valves have lost their usefulness. That's a bad deal, because these people then have a lot of trouble getting the blood pumped from their foot up to their heart. And that leads to incredible swelling in their legs frequently. It leads to sores on their feet. Very difficult nursing problems to solve. It takes a long time to heal those sort of things. So these little valves are very important. The other thing that then leads to is once you have the valves not working right, you don't have the blood being pumped up, and it sort of sits there and flows back and forth. And whenever blood does that, it can clot. And clots can form in your leg down here, and those clots can get really big, extend all the way up into your belly even, and then suddenly break off, go to your heart, go to your lungs, and kill you. That's called a pulmonary embolus. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Most patients, when they go to surgery these days, because while you're in surgery, let's just say you're going to have a 3-hour operation, the muscle pump is going to completely not work because your muscles are going to be paralyzed. You will not be able to move a muscle, so to speak. And so there will be no help getting the blood out of the legs. And that's why a lot of people used to form blood clots during surgery. The initial clot would form during surgery, and over the next 3 to 7 days, the clot would get bigger and bigger, and then it would break off and go to the heart. And sometimes a pulmonary embolus can be as big, it can be a handful of clot. I mean, it can be a really lot of clot that forms up and down the leg. Any of you guys know Dan Blocker? Remember Dan Blocker? Boy, you guys didn't live through the days of Bonanza. Bonanza was the #1 TV show in America all through the 60s and early 70s. And it was a story about this old guy who had 3 sons, and they lived on this big farm, and they were really rich and lived out in California somewhere, or Nevada, I think. It was called the Ponderosa. And the youngest of the 3 kids, was Hoss. And Hoss was this big old fat guy. I mean, he wasn't morbidly obese, but he was a big guy. And he had a gallbladder operation one day, about 4 years into the show. And he had his gallbladder surgery, and 4 days later he was getting ready to go home. The doctor came by to see him in the morning. Somebody was gonna pick him up at the hospital and take him home in the afternoon. And he got up to walk up and down the halls at about 11 o'clock that morning, as I recall the article, and he dropped over dead. He died on the spot of a pulmonary embolus, a clot that had formed in his legs. And that's a pretty typical picture, is it happening 4 days later. Now that was in the days when gallbladder surgeries were done through 7-inch incisions, and now they're done through, half a centimeter incisions and done laparoscopically. And patients go home the very same day, so it's not as big a problem as it used to be. But then nothing else is as big a problem as it used to be. One of the things that every time I did an operation, I would always order, it was in my standard orders, was to apply the compression devices. And basically they were a large balloon system that were plastic, and the nurses would slip them over the patients from their foot all the way up to their high thigh. And then it hooked up to a little air pumping machine, and it would inflate those balloons basically all around the leg in order to compress the veins and push the blood out. And it would go up and down about every 15 seconds. And it was all under the covers, so we never really saw them. But that was the whole idea, was to keep that blood moving in those leg veins during surgery to prevent clots forming. So these valves are very important, and phlebitis is the problem when the valves get into trouble.
Question?
Yeah.
Would habitual leg crossing contribute to phlebitis?
Well, that's why they always make you uncross your legs.
So it is a contributor?
I would guess it could be, but in general, if you're healthy enough to cross your legs, you're probably okay. I see these yoga people that are doing that crap all the time, and I'm thinking, they're so healthy. They don't have to worry.
Well, I mean, just like sitting at the desk with my legs crossed for like a couple hours or something.
I don't think it's a problem, because you don't sit there with your leg crossed for a couple hours. You take it down and cross it the other way, you move it around, just like we're always moving on our butt in order to allow blood to flow to the skin that we're sitting on and the muscles that are directly under that. That's just and some days you guys are bored to tears by what I'm having to talk about, and you're out here you're all shifting spots all the time, and I can see it. So anyway, yeah, that's a good question. I don't think it matters in younger people. I'll tell you what I do, and I'm 66 and a half years old right now, and every time I'm going to go ride on an airplane and be stuck in a little seat for 3 or 4 hours, I always take an aspirin before I get on, and I never sit there for more than 30 minutes. I always get up and walk to the bathroom. Even if I don't need to go to the bathroom, I'll just walk up and down the hall a little bit, or just stand up and bend your legs and straighten them out, because airplanes are notorious for clots forming on long airplane rides.
Increases blood pressure too in an airplane, or just?
Well, I don't think it changes your blood pressure much, but it just makes you very immobile. Yeah. Let's talk about where the blood lives in your body at any one time. If you could instantly stop all of the blood flow in your body, where would the blood be at that instant? And indeed, only about 30 to 35% of your blood is actually in your heart, in your arteries, and in your capillaries at the time. Most of your blood is in the venous system. 2/3 of it, you see, is in your veins. That's because the veins are a lot bigger, and they can stretch more, and they're very low pressure. And so not only is there a lot in the venous system, but a lot of that blood is really found in these big venous networks in the liver, the bone marrow, and the skin, where blood just can kind of hang out in big veins there and big sinusoids at any one time. Let's talk about a term that you need to know. It's called capacitance. And capacitance is, it sort of means, if you just think of it as the ability to stretch. Okay, so a blood vessel that has a high capacitance is a blood vessel that has a high capacity. In other words, it can stretch and hold more blood. Veins tend to be our capacitance vessels. Those are the vessels that can stretch and hold more blood when we need them to. Okay? So know that word, capacitance. So what happens if we lose some blood? Let's say you cut your arm and you bleed a half a pint of blood. What happens? Well, the first thing that happens is, your old fight or flight kicks in and your sympathetic nerves fire off, your heart speeds up, and one of the things that happens right away is these systemic veins start to constrict. You get venoconstriction, the veins constrict, which basically pushes that venous reserve, that extra blood that was just sort of sitting there in all these big vessels, it just pushes it back into the circulation. So you suddenly don't even miss that half a unit that you lost. You have a reserve of blood in you. A lot of it is in your spleen and your liver, by the way. Spleen isn't listed here, but it's a biggie for capacitance and for storing blood. Here's a quick overview on cardiovascular physiology, and there is a PhysioX that you need to work your way through that covers this. It's really pretty good. It'll make you familiar with these terms, and I think it really makes sense. Basically, our regulation of all of this stuff is via both our brain, sympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic nervous system, as well as hormonal, mainly epinephrine and norepinephrine released by the adrenal glands. Remember that 2 chapters ago on endocrine? So those things send messages out to the blood system. Here's the blood system around the outside. You've got the heart, and it can beat really fast, or it can beat really slow. It can contract and eject a lot with each beat, or it cannot eject so much. You have an arterial blood pressure that you need to keep up to a certain extent, at least enough to pump blood up to your brain so you don't faint. You have a level of peripheral resistance. If you don't have enough blood volume or you don't have enough cardiac output, your peripheral resistance is going to turn on. All those blood vessels are going to contract down as much as possible in order to push to best use the blood you have. If you only have 80% in your system and you can close down your blood vessels and still maintain your blood pressure, that's a good thing. So that's this thing called peripheral resistance, controlled by the arterioles, the small blood vessels going out. Capillary pressure can alter. If you need to suck more fluid in, that can happen out here, and a lot of fluid can move from your interstitial fluid back into your capillaries, and then you've increased the amount of blood volume that your body can pump around. Venous pressure is always pretty darn low, but we do have the ability to change the pressure in the venous system. We have the ability of those capacitance veins to contract down, which then puts more blood out into the venous system, which sends more blood back to more venous return back to the heart. More venous return going into the heart means more cardiac output coming out the other side. Because remember Starling's law, more in, more out. The more you have coming back to the heart, the more you can pump out. The more flowing back to the heart, the higher pressure you can generate to send more blood out to your body. And that's a good thing in general to limit. So, a few terms you need to learn from that PhysioX, and we'll talk about it here a bit. Pressure. Well, really the only thing that generates pressure in our cardiac system is the heart. The heart generates, with each squeeze of that big pump, it generates enough pressure to overcome all the resistance necessary to not only pump the blood out through the arteries, but it leaves enough pressure in the veins to pump it back to the heart. Now it gets a little help with the muscle pump in the legs helping to pump that blood back, but that certainly helps. Absolute pressure is less important than the pressure gradient. What does that mean? Well, what is the pressure gradient? Well, the pressure gradient is the difference between the arterial or the systolic pressure and the venous pressure. You remember that old heart curve we came up with in the heart itself, and it comes back up and then goes up. Well, the pressure gradient is the difference between the bottom and the top, okay? In other words, it's your pulse pressure. Now, you might have a heart pressure, your pressure might be 100, but if it's not different between arterial and venous, you're not going to feel a pulse, are you? And indeed, when you're on the heart pump in bypass surgery, doing surgery, it's a roller pump. It's just pumping all the time. There is no 120/80. It's just 95 or something like that. It's just a straight line pressure because it's not going up and down because there isn't this big pump pumping. The pressure gradient is basically the difference in pressure between the top and the bottom. Okay? Circulatory pressure is the pressure that's actually the pressure going into a region and the pressure coming out. That's going to tell you how much pressure is going to flow. One way to look at that is what is the pressure between the pressure at the heart, right as the blood leaves the heart in the aorta, and as it gets out into those peripheral capillary beds. Now, when it goes from your heart out to your peripheral, to your finger, say, what has it had to go through? Well, it's had to go through all these pipes. It's had to go through a series of gradually getting smaller pipes. It's given off blood to supply the vessels of these muscles here and these muscles here. So there's less blood getting down here than there was up here, right? And there's all these arterioles that have muscle precapillary sphincters that can close down and resist the blood flowing out there. So while the overall distance is the pressure at the heart and the pressure at the peripheral capillary beds, it's a little more complicated than that. Force is proportional to the pressure differences of difference in P divided by R, or resistance. This F does not stand for force. This is in your, I think this slide is in your set. And just know that that word should not say force. That word should say flow. In other words, the flow is proportional to the pressure difference divided by the resistance. Okay? Pressure difference, arterial versus venous pressure, systolic pressure versus diastolic pressure divided by the resistance. So as the resistance goes up, the flow goes down. Make sense? How do we measure blood pressure? Well, we have a number of ways to measure it. One is arterial blood pressure, and that's the blood pressure that when you put a cuff on somebody's arm, you're measuring their arterial blood pressure. We usually measure it all in millimeters of mercury. 1 atmosphere is how many millimeters of mercury? 760. Tonight, just for your interest, and it makes me think about it when I'm thinking air pressures and stuff. Tonight, the Monday night football game is going to be played in Mexico City. First time in 10 years the NFL has played a game in Mexico. The deal in Mexico City is that the elevation of the field there is 9,000 feet. Now, the highest field in America is Mile High Stadium in Denver, which is actually 5,280 feet above sea level. And so when teams go to play in Denver, they always have oxygen on the sideline because there's not enough oxygen in the air there, or at least not what people are used to at sea level. And so it's going to be interesting tonight because this is at 9,000, so it's almost twice as high. Huh?
So polluted too.
And it's polluted, absolutely. It's totally polluted in Mexico City. You
Wow,
almost need to have a gas mask to walk around there.
That's
Yeah.
an unfair advantage for them.
Well, it's two American teams that are going down there to
Oh,
play,
okay.
so it's going to work on both of them. But you're right. And you remember when the Olympics were held in Mexico City about 20 years ago, you probably don't remember that, but I do. And when the Olympics were going to be held in Mexico City, all of the American athletes spent months in advance training in Colorado. In fact, the Olympic Training Center is in Boulder, Colorado, which isn't 9,000, but it is about 5,000 feet, which enables them to accommodate for that. Their erythropoietin kicks in, raises their hematocrit, they got more blood, they can carry more oxygen, and hopefully they can go higher, faster, stronger, and that what the Olympic thing is. Anyway, so you have different pressures to think about: blood pressure, capillary hydrostatic pressure. That's the pressure that's actually out there in the capillaries, going into the capillaries. Venous pressure is the pressure in the venous system. Now, usually this pressure here is max is about 120. This pressure here, the max is about 10. So most of the pressure has been used up by the time you get into the venous system. Yes?
Whenever they take your blood pressure, they tell you to uncross your legs. Would that give you a false reading of it being higher or lower?
Well, it would make it a little bit higher, because what that does is when you uncross your leg, it increases your cardiac return, your venous return. If you blocked off the venous return from one leg by being crossed, then you open it, that sends more blood back to your heart, which should raise your pressure a little bit. But you should just always measure it the same way every time, you know, that's the whole deal. They're trying to just make it the same every time. This is a little confusing. Let me go on and show you the next slide, which I think is, well, let's see. Let me go to where's the slide I want to show you, damn it. Okay. I guess I better work through these terms. And then we'll get to the summary slides, which are always the best. So the pressure across the systemic circuit is about 100 millimeters, because the average pressure coming out of the heart, even though it's 120 over 80, it's actually closer to 100, because the heart, remember, spends more time in diastole than it does in systole. And systole is when it's 120, diastole is when it's 80. So we're going to talk about, well, what's the continuous pressure in just a second. So the circulatory pressure must overcome total peripheral resistance, and that's the resistance of the entire system. That's all those things we were just talking about going down the arm. It's also all the things causing resistance to blood flow working its way back. Total peripheral resistance is caused by a number of things, and two things increase vascular resistance, for sure. One of them is the friction between the blood and the vessel walls. Now remember that blood is thicker than water, so it doesn't exactly just slide through these blood vessels. There is friction between the flowing blood and the wall of the vessel. Now, the longer the vessel, the more resistance, right? The smaller the diameter of the vessel, the more resistance, right? Because obviously, if you got a great big vessel, the blood in the middle isn't getting any friction from the walls at all. It's just flowing along there. But the stuff around the edges is. So as vessels get smaller, resistance goes up. In fact, resistance increases exponentially as vessel diameter goes up. Now what does that mean? It means by the exponent. So resistance squared instead of resistance times 2. When you went from 100% down to 50%, your resistance went up by a factor of 2, which is a factor of 4. Think on that, and it'll become clear from the PhysioX as well. Viscosity refers to the thickness of blood. Obviously, whole blood viscosity is about 4 times as thick as water. So it's like pouring oil down through a pipe as opposed to pouring water down through a pipe. The thicker the viscosity, the slower it's going to flow. Viscosity is related to, is another cause of resistance by the suspended materials and all the thickness of the fluid. Turbulence. Turbulence causes resistance as well. And the way I always describe that is that when I was rafting rivers, and in fact I did that a month or so ago, I think I showed you all pictures. When you're going down the Deschutes River out there, and the river is wide, and it's deep, and it's flowing along nice and easy, and there is no turbulence. There's no loud rocks, no rapids or anything like that that you're hearing. There is little resistance. On the other hand, when the water narrows down, there's a bunch of rocks sitting in the river, then the water has to go a lot faster. It makes a lot of noise. The water is churning and churning, and that's all increasing the resistance and basically slowing the flow of the river as it goes down towards the ocean. Okay? So that's what turbulence is. And we have lots of turbulence in our system, in our cardiac system. A lot of it's in the heart chambers. There, you saw how, maybe you haven't cut them open yet, but the inside of the heart is pretty rough. The valves are kind of rough. If you have atherosclerotic plaques, those narrow areas like I drew for you over there, they can be very rough. They can all cause abnormal turbulence. So here's the terms that you need to understand to answer the questions about this cardiac physiology stuff. You need to understand what blood flow means. Blood flow is measured in liters or milliliters per second, or liters per minute, usually liters per second. Blood pressure is the hydrostatic pressure, the water pressure, pushing blood through the capillaries. The circulatory pressure is the whole system put together between where it leaves the aorta, it leaves the heart at the aorta, and where it gets back to the right atrium, coming back through the vena cava back to the heart. Hydrostatic pressure is like water pressure. It's like that's why we have water towers to keep the pressure high enough so that if you live on the second floor of your apartment building and you turn your tap on, you still have enough water pressure to get water out. If we didn't have water towers,